Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the invitation. It's very nice to be physically present at a conference after a long time. Yeah, and I'm sorry for those who can't be here and wanted to be here. And yeah, I probably should have sent an email to all the speakers saying, "Oh, come and let's gather and try to get over all the difficulties." But yeah, this will be about this is in the session type theory in type theory. So this will be precisely about this talk will be precisely about this topic. So let's be very concrete. What is the syntax of type theory? And if we are very concrete, we can say that a term in type theory is a string. So we have lots of different strings, which are all terms in type theory. These all kind of represent the function which adds its input to itself, and it's applied to 3. And there are several different ways presenting this, but so maybe for our taste, saying that a term is a string is a bit too low level, in the sense that there's lots of unnecessary information in these strings. So for example, here is this string lambda x dot x plus x applied to 3, and here is this other string which looks very similar. The only difference is that here there's a space and there's another space here. So these space and these which don't appear here. So these spaces seem a bit too much information there, and so we might want to say that these two terms should be the same because they only differ by the extra spaces. Or another thing that we might say is that this 3a, that's not a proper thing, that not a proper input for this function. What is 3a? It's not even a number, so this should be excluded. So then one way to fix this, or to make this precise, is to define some relational strings which say which two strings are equal, and define the predicate on strings, which strings are the proper strings. But we don't usually do that, but instead we say that a term is not a string anymore, but a term is a list of lexical elements. And then we have a notion of lexical elements, and only those lists are proper terms, which are built out of these lexical elements. So the one which had the 3a in it, which is not a lexical element, is excluded. That's why it turned gray. And then, because spaces are not lexical elements, they don't matter, these two strings became the same. So viewed as lists of lexical elements, these are exactly the same terms. There's no difference between them. And then you can continue this process and realize that, okay, like here is this string which only differs from these two, basically by having this extra bracket outside. And this bracketing structure is exactly the same as here. So somehow this should be identified. And there is this one where there is a missing bracket, ending bracket here. So maybe this should be excluded as the proper ones. So again, instead of saying something about lexical elements, we go to a different level and say that, okay, terms are not lists anymore, but they are some kind of trees, or abstract syntax trees. And then these three things which were different as strings, now they are exactly the same. They are represented by the same tree. And this one, which didn't have the closing bracket, this is not a tree at all. It's not a proper tree, so we just exclude it. And then we continue this game a bit more. So we realize that the name of bound variables don't matter. So this lambda y plus y is the same as lambda x plus x. So these should also be identified. And also there is this y here, which is not. We don't know where it's coming from, so it's not in scope. So we will exclude this one, and then we come to a level of abstraction which is called a well-scoped syntax tree or abstract binding tree, where this one is excluded, and these ones are all the same. So one way to make this formal is to say that in an abstract binding tree, we have collections of, we have a collection of trees for each natural number, which tells us the number of free variables or possible number of free variables in that term. And then variables are denoted by natural numbers up to that number. And this way, these are exactly the same. Okay, but we can go further and note that here we apply true to this function, but this function performs an addition with its input, and true is a Boolean value. It's not clear what addition means on Booleans, so maybe this should be excluded. So in the next step, we don't identify anything, we only exclude this non-well-typed one. So now terms become well-typed syntax trees. This is also called intrinsic syntax. And we're still not done, because we might say that, okay, if we apply this function and if we perform the calculation, we should end up with 6, right? Because 3 plus 3 is 6. And that's when we come to the level of abstraction, which is the well-typed syntax tree quotiented by conversion. This is also called the algebraic presentation or the equational theory of the syntax, or the model-theoretic description. This is what we saw in the first talk today. We generalized algebraic theory. If you present type theory with categories, with families, then you end up at this level of abstraction. But so these levels of abstraction, they are general, they work for any logic, or even I think for any programming language, you can present the language at all these levels of abstraction. So this is not specific to type theory at all, but type theory will be the example in this talk for this. And in fact, in type theory, it's very natural to do the last two steps at the same time. So here do the excluding of non-well type things and identifying of the convertible things or convertible terms. It's natural to do at the same time, because typing in type theory refers to conversion. So you can't really separate the two issues, while in simpler languages, it's possible to separate these two steps completely. So, and usually these steps, these levels of abstractions are going abstract. They correspond to, in computer science, they correspond to phases of a compiler, which compiles a high-level language to a low-level language. So lexical analysis, parsing, scope checking, type checking, these are really phases of the compilation process, and they can be made precise using these notions. When we go up, as I showed, we exclude some elements. So those correspond to the error messages that one can get when type checking or compiling a program, like there's an invalid lexical elements or something is not in scope. And at the higher levels of abstractions, we identify things which were different at the lower level, like for well-scoped syntax trees, we have that lambda x.x is lambda the same as lambda y.y, or we have when we quotient by conversion, we have this equality. We can also go concrete. So basically what we do when we go from a higher level to a lower level is we pick elements of equivalence classes. Like when you turn a list of lexical elements into a string, we have to decide where to put the spaces. Or when we turn a syntax tree into a list of elements, we somehow have to add the brackets there. Or pick variable name. And the interesting thing, when you quotient by conversion, if you want to go from the quotiented syntax to well-typed syntax, or to any of the lower levels, you have to know, you need to respect the quotient. So you have to give the same results for convertible programs. So basically you have to normalize first, and then you can return the normal form or do something similar to respect the quotient. Yeah, and I wanted to mention here that going from concrete to abstract is also called elaboration. So that's what combining all of these steps. So basically when we write something in type theory, you can think about it as if it was written in this well-typed syntax quotiented level of abstraction, but the only thing we can write on paper is the strings. So what we really mean is the elaboration of the string which we wrote there. And so if you work on a lower level of abstraction, then you might have to prove theorems which are unnecessary if you were working at the correct or higher level of abstraction. So for example, for syntax trees, you don't need to prove the theorem, or in fact the theorem doesn't even make sense that alpha renaming preserves matching brackets, because alpha renaming makes sense for syntax trees, but matching brackets is not a notion that you can express at the level of syntax trees. Or for well-scoped syntax trees, that alpha renaming preserves typing, that's another low-level theorem. That sounds a bit better, but still you don't want to prove it, because typing should be considered at a level where alpha equivalent terms are equal. But the same way, conversion preserves typing. This is the main step of most soundness proofs for a programming language. But if you're working with well-typed syntax, or if conversion is well-typed, then you don't have to prove it, it's automatic. And on the level of quotiented well-typed syntax, the fact that normalization is sound is automatic. By soundness, I mean that two convertible terms are mapped to the same normal forms. This is because of the quotient, you can't even do any construction which is not sound in this sense. So this is again something that you don't have to prove if you work at this level of abstraction. And in fact, there's one higher level of abstraction which doesn't completely fit in this picture, because it doesn't identify anything different and doesn't exclude anything which was there at the lower level of abstraction. But for describing a language, it's nicer to work at this language, at this level, which is this higher order abstract syntax, where what we have, the non-theorem, is that everything is stable under substitution. Because in higher order abstract syntax, you don't talk about context or substitutions. Those are automatically given by the system, and then you don't have to prove, and this is automatically true. While this is not necessarily true on level 6. And what do we now? If we want to define type theory in type theory, we need some features of our meta theory or our meta type theory to encode our syntax at one of these levels of abstraction. So the first few are simple. So for strings, we need strings, we need lists, we need inductive types to define syntax trees in general. So each operation becomes one of the constructors of the inductive types. Then if we want well-scoped syntax trees, we need a larger class of inductive type, indexed inductive types, because we want to index by natural numbers or the set of free variables or an indexing set of our terms. Then for well-typed syntax, we need the inductive types in general. So I will, in the next few slides, I will show a concrete example for all of these representation. Then for well-typed syntax quotiented, we need quotient inductive types. And for higher index order abstract syntax, we need QIITs with bindings. So let me show you a concrete example. So if I am at level 1, a term is just a string, and that's it. At level 2, a term is a list of lexical elements. So we have a set of lexical elements and lists built out of those. Then at level 3, this is when the language is given by a BNF grammar. The language is given by a simple inductive type with these constructors. So here we have a constructor for variables and lambda and application, and then we have an infinite set of variables. So this is an example. This is formalized in Abel, Ullmann, and Weizsäcker's paper, where they formalize normalization for type theory. I will come back to this paper. Then for well-scoped syntax trees, we have an index set of terms. So for every natural number, we have or index type. So by set, I mean the universe of types. But for simplicity, I just write set. So for each natural number, we have a type of terms with maximum that many free variables. And then if a natural number is less than n, then we get a variable. We can refer to our free variables in a term. Then what lambda does is that from a term with one extra free variable gives you a term with one less free variable, and the application just keeps the number of variables the same. Then well-typed, if we want to represent type theory as well-typed tree, we need inductive types, as shown in the paper Type Theory Should Eat Itself by James Chapman. So here it's an inductive type, which means that there are two sorts at least. So context is a type, and the second sort of types is indexed by context. So you can't talk about types on their own, there's no set of types. Instead, for each context, you have a set of types which is meaningful in that context. And these are not simply mutual types. They cannot be encoded as a mutual inductive type or an indexed inductive type, because there's a more intertwined dependency between them. So there's the empty context, and then the context extension, which is an operator which forms a context, refers to types. So if I have a context and a type in that context, then I obtain a new context. Then I have some more operations and terms. So at the last levels, terms were indexed just by the number of free variables. Now they are indexed by a context, which is like the number of free variables, but also includes the type of each free variable. And the term is also indexed by the type. And this is important because, for example, for application, we really want that the term, the first term has type AROB, the second term should have type A, and then we obtain a term of type B. So this plugging these trees together is controlled by these type indices here. Yes, and then the well-typed tree quotiented, or the QIIT definition, which is the same as what Peter Dibier showed in the first talk today, category with families definition of type theory, where you have context types just as before, but you also need to refer to substitutions or context morphisms, which is a family of types between any two contexts. And then you have substitution operations. So if you have a type in gamma and the substitution from delta to gamma, then you obtain a type in delta where this substitution is applied, and then you have a similar operation for terms, which depends on the substitution for types. And then you are able to state the equalities, like the beta equality. You need a substitution to be able to talk about these, so that if lambda is applied, if a lambda t is applied to a term, then you get the body of the lambda where you substitute the last free variable for u. And this way, so at the first talk today, we saw almost the full presentation of this one. And with higher order abstract syntax is a more condensed description of the previous one. So where we don't need to talk about contexts and types, those are kind of given automatically by the system. So here types are just given by a type or a set, and the terms are indexed over types, but they don't return in the universe of types, but they return in set bar, and set bar is the universe of locally representable presheaves, because this, as Hoffman showed in 1999, higher order abstract syntax can be given meaning by presheaves. So this is this extra component that we have if we want to talk about higher order abstract syntax, this barred thing. So we have the barred universe. Then function space is just tie arrow, tie arrow, tie. So from two types, it returns a new type. But lambda is interesting because lambda used to have, used to be defined, in a one larger context. So there's one extra free variable. You can see here it's gamma comma a that corresponds to n+1. There's one more free variable of type A. Here as well, there's one more free variable of type A. And at this level of abstraction, that's why this is called higher order abstract syntax. This is a higher order constructor. So it's not strictly positive if we look at it naively, because here there's an arrow on the left-hand side of the arrow. And this TMA is the one of the sorts which is being defined, but this is not a simple function space. This is the barred function space, which is only available because this sort was also a barred sort or a representable sort. So on the left-hand side of a barred function arrow, I can only write TMs because that's my only barred sort. And this is why this makes sense. So this can be translated to this particular first order QIIT definition, which is strictly positive. So when you restrict yourself to use these barred things in this way, then you have the very nice concise language, but which can be translated to a QIIT. And the beta rule is the left-hand side of the beta rule looks the same as before. So lumT applied to you, while the right-hand side uses meta-theoretic application, but that's also the barred application because this is a barred function. So I need to use the barred space operation, which is the barred application. Okay, so to relate all of these levels, I can go concrete in a different way. So there's a generic way to go concrete from QIITs with bindings to QIITs to IITs and so on, which works for any algebraic theory or any higher order abstract syntax or any well-typed syntax quotiented and so on, not only the one for type theory. These are generic constructions. So to go from QIITs with bindings to QIITs, we need a pre-sheaf model construction. So the pre-sheaves, as terms become natural transformation, and naturality will give us the information that everything respects substitution. So naturality is respecting substitution. And this is a model construction in the sense of the last talk in this session today, which will be by Thierry. He will present model constructions of type theory, where we don't simply construct a model, but take an input model and obtain an output, a new model out of it. And so this way, this higher order abstract syntax can be understood you could implement it as a library in type theory. So you don't need a new language for it. We don't even know what the proper good language for it is currently, but you can just view it as an extra compilation step. And the same thing for going from QIITs to IITs. Sorry, I lost my mouse. Okay, it's the setoid model construction, which Torsten mentioned in the previous talk. Which adds all these equalities and unfolds them, and then when you go from IITs to indexed inductive types, you can encode IITs with indexed inductive types by so-called well-formedness or typing predicates. And in fact, what you get is that when people define low-level syntax as well-scoped syntax trees, and then they define the conversion relation, then they define the typing predicate, there are lots of ad hoc choices that you can make to define the conversion relation, like is it typed, non-well typed, is it how much information is there in the terms. While this, if you start at the high level of abstraction and go down this way, then you get a concrete representation which doesn't have any ad hoc information, which is a generic method which works for anything. A similar generic method was showed in the first talk today by Peter Dibier. And then in general, you can also encode indexed inductive types as inductive types. And then inductive types can be represented by, if there are finitary inductive types, by some kind of Gödel numbering with cleverness. So this way you can go down. And what are the things, and the main question for me is, what are the things that can be done at a high level of abstraction, and what do you need a low level abstraction for? So what has been done at abstraction level 6 or 7? So one thing is that normalization can be proven at this level of abstraction. So you don't have to go to small steps rewriting and pre-syntax and non-well-typed terms to prove normalization. The statement of normalization in this setting is that, so convertible terms are equal, so why would you even normalize? The thing that you want to get out of normalization is, for example, decidability of equality, which is not a priori true if you just present an equational theory. So what you want is some inductive definition of normal forms, which is obviously decidable, and you want to show that terms in context gamma of type A are isomorphic to normal forms, and then the direction from left to right is normalization, from right to left is some kind of quoting, and completeness and stability are two directions to round trips of the isomorphism. And this can be done by the technique of normalization by evaluation, which was pioneered by Berger and Schichterberg. It can also be seen as a logical predicate proof, or using of proof-relevant logical predicates to prove normalization. But also the big step normalization can be done at this level. So big step normalization is the way usually proof assistants implement type checking or normalization for type checking. And there are papers describing these. Another thing, parametricity or abstraction theorems can be proven at this level of abstraction. Bidirectional type checking, so the elaboration algorithm can be done where the type checking results in level 6 terms where they are already quotiented, and during type checking there is some normalization happening, but in a type checking algorithm you're only required to ask whether two terms or two types are equal if they are already well typed, so if they are already at level 6. So during type checking you never need to ask about equality of lower levels. So this is why normalization at the high level is enough to implement a type checker. And more generally, lots of parts of elaboration, I don't know if all of them, because no one really formalized the proof assistant based on these principles, but for example, meta variables can also be handled. So that's a filling of implicit arguments can be also handled at level 6. There's a paper from last year, which is an example of using this technique. So their meta variables can be handled by a modality, and adding this modality to the equational theory of type theory, you can do elaboration algorithm at this level. Also conservativity proofs like Hoffman's proof of conservativity of extensional type theory over intentional type theory with function extensionality and uniqueness of identity proof can be done at this level of abstraction, or Capriotti's proof was already done at this level of abstraction on conservativity of two-level type theory over one-level type theory. This two-level type theory is a version of Vovodsky's homotopy type system. Also, you can describe things which are usually described at the low level, like call by value, call by name, call by push value. There are equational theory variants of these theories on level 6 and 7 as well. Or for compilation, closure conversion is an important step in compiling functional languages to low-level languages. This can also be described at level 6. And we have a paper by Raphael Bouquet and Christian Sattler, where some of these above are done at level 7, so at the level of higher order abstract syntax, in particular normalization, parametricity, and conservativity proofs are presented at higher order abstract syntax. So what is hard at these higher levels? So one thing is that when you want to compile to a low-level language, you need you're not allowed to break the quotient. So the low-level language needs a matching equational theory, and it can be very hard to describe what the proper equational theory of an assembly language is, which exactly matches what you start with above. Or at level 6, you cannot formalize calculi where some operations are not stable under substitution. So, for example, Martin-Löf's first presentation of type theory didn't allow substituting under lambda for philosophical reasons, and at level 6 you need more setup to allow this kind of operations which are not stable under substitution. And in practice, these abstract formalizations are underused because most proof assistants don't allow QIITs, or quotient inductive types, or initial algebras of generalized algebraic theories, in other words. So you have to use lower level encodings. In fact, the only proof assistant which allows even inductive types, which is necessary for well-typed syntax of type theory, only Agda allows them, and even they're only in a limited form. And cubical Agda, which is a experimental extension of Agda to where univalence is provable, is there you also have QIITs. And the level 7 is also quite complicated. If you want to work internally in type theory with level 7, you need modalities when you move between different models. You need something like multimodal type theory to work at this level of abstraction. One more comment could be that when I was moving up this ladder of levels of abstraction, I always said that, so for example, here, instead of defining a relational list, we kind of normalize lists into syntax trees. Here, when going from syntax trees to well-scoped ones, I didn't define alpha equivalence as a relation, but I said I use De Bruijn indices. So I don't need an explicit relation, but when I went from well-type syntax to well-type syntax quotiented, I said that I want quotients. I don't want to work at a level where I only work with representatives, but I wanted to work with quotients. So why is that? So why don't I just say, when I go from 5 to 6, that I only work with normal forms? So I should only define the theory with normal forms, and then there's no need for quotienting. But there's an issue there. One is that, in fact, it's not easier to formalize the notion of normal forms than the notion of CWFs. This is something which we don't know how to define the normal forms for type theory without referring to the equational theory of type, full equational theory of type theory. And the other thing is that when we write proofs or programs, we don't want to write normal proofs and normal programs, but it would be a very limiting language, but we want to write real programs. So here it seems that this is a natural level of abstraction where you need quotienting, while before you can get away without doing the quotienting. And I wasn't checking the time. But yeah, I think I'm a bit over time, and I have one last slide which are some questions. So one is about the previous slide. So is there a presentation of normal forms of type theory that does not refer to the equational theory? So, and by normal forms here, I mean they need to be well-typed, and that's the issue. So you can define normal forms, but if you want to define well-typed normal forms, then the types which normal forms have refer to the equational theory. And there seems to be no way of defining normal forms and normal terms and normal types mutually when they only refer to each other and don't go into the syntax, into the real equational theory. Another question is, what features of programming languages are ones which cannot be described at the algebraic level? Like what are the things that you really need to investigate, for example, with small step rewriting I would like to see nice examples of these properties that have to be investigated at a lower level. And an interesting thing is that there is this normalization proof of type theory, which is at a level, it's a proof at level 3. So I would expect that you could explain the same proof at level 7, and then going down the ladder, you would end up with the same proof as they formalized at level 3. But the curious thing is that these first 2 steps involve using the strict universe of propositions. So to define this pre-sheaf model construction and the setoid model construction, you rely on a universe of propositions, which is strictly proof irrelevant. And the proof by Abel, Ullmann, and Vezzosi, it doesn't use uniqueness of identity proofs. So there is a seeming contradiction here, which I don't know how to resolve. So maybe there's a variant. We only use parts of the pre-sheaf model and the setoid model when doing these first 2 steps, which don't involve uniqueness of identity proofs. And a general question is, what is a best calculus for working with higher order abstract syntax? You want something like inductive types where binding is built in, but then you need to be very careful when you work with these inductive types, because you need to keep track over which inductive type you are working, over which category you are working. That's all.